Thank you. I think I would prefer to leave the last question for the experts that have expertise of the region. I'm much more of a generalist and just applying my general knowledge to the region at the moment. So I'll leave that question for some of the other excellent panelists. But I did see two questions in the Q&A based on my presentation, which I'm happy to take up. The first question is, where does the international law frameworks you talked about put the Ethiopia-Somaliland MOU? That is a difficult question. As I already said in my presentation, it's a bit hard to conclude on that without knowing or without having seen the text of the agreement. We've only heard sort of rumors of which elements are included in the agreement. So in that sense, it's a bit difficult to say whether it's an elaboration of what is already included in the international legal frameworks that I discussed, or whether it's a violation or a contradiction. So I wouldn't feel comfortable concluding that without having read the text of the agreement. But what I would like to point you towards is Article 311 of the UNCLOS, which regulates the relationship between the UNCLOS and other international agreements. And so there, you can also really see the constitutional nature of the UNCLOS. And so, for example, paragraph 2 says that this convention shall not alter the rights and obligations of states parties which arise from other agreements compatible with this convention. So on the one hand, it says that the UNCLOS would not proceed over other international agreements, but only provided that they are compatible with the convention. And so that, of course, again raises transit transit facility than the one provided for an UNCLOS is allowed. And ultimately, international law, sort of works on the presumption that anything that is agreed is agreed. And then you would just have to go into sort of regime interaction and rules of lex specialis, lex posterior, etc., to see which provision ultimately prevails. The second question, do you want me to continue with the second question, or would you like to open up the floor to someone else?
Yes, as quickly as you can, yes. Because yes. I'm minded to go back to that security question. So yes, please.
Yes. So the second question relates to the EU, whether I would recommend Ethiopia to focus on regional economic integration, such as the European landlocked states, which have gained more access and more freedoms, rights, etc., through the EU. I think the EU, though, is a very unique example, which might not be able to be extrapolated to other areas because of the large amount of powers that EU member states have transferred to the EU, right? So the EU, with its common fisheries policy, has a much larger control over the maritime waters of EU member states than any other international organization does. So the fact that those landlocked states can be included within the EU obviously means that they can participate in EU maritime waters, but I don't think that example is necessarily translated to other regional areas. But of course, regional cooperation is, I think, something that could always be encouraged. But as the ambassador has already indicated, it's questionable whether that is a realistic opportunity in this particular region. So I'd like to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I do want to really get some reflection on Abtu's question as to whether the MOU has endangered security in the region. As I understand it from Dr. Getachel, the security situation is changed anyway. It's a very dynamic system, and Ethiopia's approach to security is changed. And I think Ambassador Randers has also made a similar point. I gather from both that the answer to that question, unless I'm wrong for the two of them, is no, it does not endanger or doesn't create or heighten the security in the region. But I could be wrong. If both of you feel that my interpretation of your presentation, or it doesn't necessarily heighten the security in the region, then please intervene. But while you are reflecting on that, I want to give the floor to the one who has not spoken, with Dr. Oderman. If you wish to reflect on this a little bit, I know your specialism is in the field of de facto state, but if you wish to skip the question, that's fine. Then I can quickly get an answer on this, because I still haven't got an answer on this yet.
So, which question was to me?
Question as to whether you thought the MOU kind of endangered security in the region.
Oh, on this one, I think we should. Well, on the security issues, I can't really say much. I'm mostly focusing on the legal issues, but I think that the issue of recognizing a territory in the state of Somalia, which is recognized in international law, would still be seen as an unfriendly act. Your question about whether or not it would be moving towards a more peaceful way of resolving disputes. Yes, it's not using force in this area, but it is an unfriendly act by recognizing a territory which is seen as internally part of the sovereign territory of Somalia. Of course, that's better than the alternative of using a force to take that area and trying to resolve this by using force, or have access by using force. But I don't think it's necessarily can be viewed as the most peaceful type of action as well. Maybe negotiating with other states as well would be how we would see a more peaceful way of resolving this issue, rather than doing something which is seen as an unfriendly act, which would be seen as, not just by Somalia, but by other states in the region, as undermining the territorial integrity of Somalia. On the security issues, I'm not sure whether or not I can really say much more about that.
All right. Well, that's fair enough. Okay. I'm mindful that we have a speaker who has joined, and I'd like to give the floor to them. So, between the ambassador and Mr. Gadachov, is there something new you could add to reflect on this question, other than what you've already said? Because I think there's a lot you've already said about the security situation in the region.
Okay, finally, I don't think Ethiopia's quest for access to the sea has its own downside effect for the security of the region. Rather, I would argue that otherwise it would benefit it would be for the benefit of the region. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador, is there any?
Yeah, I think if I may, Chair, just say I'd come at a different angle to the way you've interpreted it. What this has done in a region where the mood is very, very febrile, it has accentuated just that tendency. Therefore, an inclination to misunderstand and misread the motives of others. That's the danger that we have. So that can become the grounds for insecurity. Practically, Eritrea may be saying, well, are we next? How does Ethiopia want to move on the next stage? Is the port of Berber or whatever it is decided the only thing, or not? This is what is triggered by the MOU and the manner in which it was, if you will, presented. That's the issue, and it's for Ethiopia then to give reassurances or whatever to the various neighbors that might feel affected by it. And Ethiopia has long experience in handling these things. It has managed to, if you look at the other water course, rather than the Red Sea, the Nile, Ethiopia has been negotiating that for some years. It has succeeded in establishing a dam which has upturned thousands of years of history in terms of who controls the flow of the water of the Nile. And so it is. That's a sweet water strategy. Now there's a salt water strategy. And I think we're at the very early stages of that. And the region, final point is, either one goes around creating facts on the ground and then negotiating afterwards, or one tries to see if there's a context of regional cooperation that can be built. And in that context, absolutely, Ethiopia has to be given every assurance, long-term, that a vast population like that has the right and ability to maintain a secure access to the sea for trade, its economic survival, and anything else. So we need to get to that, but we're nowhere near that yet. And it falls to all parties to find a way just to get together and put these issues squarely on the table and talk them through.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And I think, Professor Mengistu, I have to apologize and hold you for a moment because I do want to hear at least a reflection from our Somali participants. Although I'm not entirely sure which of our two have joined. I don't know if you can introduce yourself. Who's just joined? Is it Dr. Farah or Dr. Hida?
Yes, thank you so much. This is Dr. Muhammad Farah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. You're very welcome to join, and please, we've been expecting you. So we expected a little contribution from you on the Somali and Ethiopian deal. It would be very helpful if you give us some kind of inside track on the matter. Now, we've been very tight with our time, so we offered everybody 15 minutes. So we will give you 15 minutes, after which, Professor Mengistu, I'm coming back to you. I know your hand is up, and I wanted to stay there. So please, you have 15 minutes.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think, the issue of access to sea and the question of Somaliland, the quest for international recognition has always been one of the key, major dynamics in the Horn of Africa. And I think there are key main factors that have shaped up the MOU between Somalia and Ethiopia. And these key main factors are like, number one, Ethiopia's, long quest for access to sea, and Somaliland's, quest for international recognition. And I think these two major factors were the ones were the key drivers of signing that deal back in January in 2024. There is also regional dynamics that has also shaped up, and these regional dynamics are driven by the interests of the China government and the UAE. The United Arab Emirates have, invested hugely in Somaliland for the last 6-7 years now, and China has kept investing in Djibouti, a neighboring country to Somaliland and Ethiopia, for the last 20 years. And the other major factor that has also created the MOU was the prolonged Somalia conflict in Somalia, and the daily international, engagement and still being brought in Somalia. There has also been a talk between Somalia and Somalia for the last 10 years now, and this process has been into an unproductive way. And those talks, which was mediated by different governments, have not been, the outcome have not been implemented. So Somaliland has always been asked itself, to exit the status quo, because the status quo is not actually, it's one which is not being benefited by Somaliland, but it's one which is being benefited by Somalia. And Ethiopia has been using the Djibouti port for this maritime trade since 1999 until now. And I think Ethiopia has a right to diversify its maritime trade, and the use of purple ports and other ports in the region is one which will enable Ethiopia to have that kind of diversification. Ethiopia cannot be held, hostage for being a landlocked state. I think that deal has not, there are some scholars, academics, and diplomats who argue that the deal between Somalia and Ethiopia has endangered the regional security of Africa. I don't see that, and we don't have any evidence to support such kind of arguments. And the other, with the deal signed between Somalia and Ethiopia, there are, key, international communities, key governments like the US, who are all, pushing, trying to make sure that the deal is not implemented. And I think, it is, the argument mainly presented by the international community, whose interest is that, the deal is going to actually, make Somalia a more dangerous place than it was before. And that's a link to the national security of Somalia, but at the same time to the regional security of Horn of Africa. And you have asked, a question about whether the MOU has impacted on the regional security of Somalia and the Horn. It's very important to note that the South Central Somalia, with all the investments for billions of dollars from the international community, is still an unsafe place. Al-Shabaab control is 70% of Southern Somalia. The consensus, the political consensus between Mogadishu and the federal member states is the worst place. And I think with all those dynamics, still the South Central Somalia, in general, seen is unstable. And the argument is that, and the argument presented by those academics and scholars, saying that with this deal, Somalia is going to actually face, a heightened, security from Al-Shabaab. I think it has, even as Ethiopian troops have been there for the last 20 years, trying to actually make sure that state becomes more functional. It has not been successful, and the consequences of actually supporting Somalia as a one state and the policy mainly driven by powerful global powers like one Somalia policy is not going to actually to benefit all. There is also a question about the sovereignty of Somalia. Theoretically, under international law, Somalia is being considered a sovereign state. Realities on the ground is different. Somaliland has been an independent de facto state and sovereign state for the last 30 years. Somalia has no business, whatever it is, in relation to Somaliland. So Somaliland cannot be actually dictated by the logic of the international law, but it has to be, the reality on the ground has to translate into a more logical, So I think the deal benefits both Ethiopia and Somaliland, and Ethiopia has no right under international law to recognize any entity, and Somaliland is not a separatist or secessionist movement. It has a history, and it has actually done something that Somalia has not been able to do for the last 8 years. And the MOU is a continuation of the 30 years relationship between Somalia and Ethiopia. Ethiopia uses for report, and with this MOU, Ethiopia will have a direct access to sea by actually granting Ethiopia a naval base, but at the same time negotiating with Ethiopia in terms of the commercial aspect of the report. So I think this is a win-win, and we don't see any major fallout of the MOU between Somalia and Somalia. And the implication this is going to have on Somalia is going to be less because of the reality on the ground. And Somalia will not be actually in a position, to dictate the foreign policy and the interests of Ethiopia. But it is the international community, particularly the US and other Western governments, who are pushing and actually trying to lock the MOU between Somalia and Ethiopia. But the worst thing to do also is to ignore the case, the case of Somaliland, and not to support the continued dialogue between Somalia and Somalia for the last 10 years. The interest shown by the US and other governments in terms of the MOU should have been done with regards to talks between Somalia and Somalia. The situation would have been now more different. So I think in the MOU, with all its complexities and challenges, is actually a benefit for the regional integration of Horn of Africa and for the close relationship between Somaliland and Ethiopia. And finally, I would like to conclude by saying Ethiopia's presence in Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea will not actually endanger the interests of of Somalia or the interests of Egypt or the interests of any other one, but it would actually promote the maritime security of the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And we know exactly what's happening now in that important choke point of Bab el-Mandeb, where more than 900 million maritime goods of value passes through every year. So Ethiopia will actually contribute to the maritime trade and security of Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And I don't see any major problem in giving actually and granting Ethiopia and access to sea. So that's my remark. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farah. You kind of put a very optimistic perspective on the MOU. Ambassador Randolph's put a very pragmatic perspective on it. And Dr. Gatachal put what I call a realistic perspective on it. And all of this in the context of what the academics are telling us. Well, the state of international law is very clear that Somaliland is not a state yet, although nothing in international law stops it from entering into an agreement with a state. And Ethiopia has done that. Or the conversation of the idea that Ethiopia is, by law, entitled to have access to the sea. I think the picture becomes very complex at the moment in terms of what the potential next steps will be. So it's kind of a good opportunity for us to have a very excitable discussion. So thank you very much, Dr. Farah. I want to come to you, Samingesti, if you're still there. You had your hand up. I don't know whether the new contribution has made any. Oh, there you are. Yes, please. You have the floor. What's your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. By the way, thank you for the organizers. Gratefully appreciated for Professor Hari and the rest. Gratefully appreciated. Let me try to make absolutely clear that access to the sea has been a very controversial topic in the history of Ethiopia in the 19th century as well. As you know, it is said, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but Ethiopia used to control the whole part of the Horn of Africa. But because of colonialism, we are quarreling among ourselves. What I want to say is that I do not think that the agreement made or the MOU made will solve the problem. It is a political problem. It is a question of leadership. Whether we have in the Horn of Africa leaders who are committed, dedicated, selfless leaders who are very much interested to promote the interest of the people of the Horn of Africa. I still believe that some of the leaders are still mentally colonized. We have not come out from colonial mindset. So for me, I think there should be some sort of a confederal arrangement between Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea, and so forth. And I think from the point of view of Ethiopia, I strongly believe a lot of investment has to be made to promote the brother relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and at the same time with the people of Somalia. So that's exactly why I still believe that it is not a legal issue. Or the legal issue will not solve a problem. I have made a study more than 50 years ago on the law of the sea, on the extension of the 12-mile zone. I understand, although I'm a student of international law, frankly speaking, international law is the law of the powerful. I still repeat, international law is the law of the powerful. But we have governments who cannot feed their own people. So I feel the question of leadership is absolutely cardinal in solving the problem of the Horn of Africa. There's no way to compare the Horn of Africa government or sort of regional association or integration with EU.
Okay.
The Union are more advanced 100 years. We are 100 years back. And therefore, we have to find solutions which are amicable or which takes into account the low level of development, both technologically, financially, and politically as well. So my view is that the damage has been done many years ago. I think Ethiopian leadership have to play a very important role, and Ethiopia should not be basically landlocked. It has a better interest to find out if the United States or other powers can go beyond their borders to secure and promote their own economic national interest, Ethiopia also has the right, the historical right for that matter, to basically have access to the sea. Frankly speaking, if I were a leader, I would have done a different thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I mean, and that's a good contribution behind which raises a very interesting question. We know that the ambassador of Ethiopia was expelled or has been expelled from Somalia, which gives me the impression that there was not this, as you call it, Mengistu, the brotherly conversation. The ambassador raised the same point about this. So the question is, what is it that stops this kind of conversation rather than the kind of claim to sovereignty and independent action, knowing that independent action will always impact on relations? So, what is it that's stopping African countries, or at least the leaders, as Professor Mengistu raised, from talking to each other? I mean, that's a question that I thought came out of there, but if it's not a real question, Nelly, I'd like to come to you then.
Well, Professor Kasazian, he was referring to confederal arrangements. I mean, Kenya with Ruto has been trying to, mediate between Somalia and Ethiopia. And one of the suggestions that they have come up with is a maritime agreement under the leadership of the regional international organizations, which is ICHA, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. And so that's probably another way out of resolving this confrontation between Somalia and Ethiopia. So this is kind of an overarching suggestion from the part of Kenyans to come up with a regional, maritime kind of policy arrangement, so that not just Ethiopia but also South Sudan, would also benefit from this kind of arrangement. And so confederation is one way, but also regional and overarching arrangements under the partnership of IGAD would also be another potential solution to consider.
Okay. Right. Thank you. I don't see any more hands up, and there is a question in the Q&A by Mikhail Gebru. Are you still there? No. Well, I mean, I think this questioner would like to hear a little bit more explanation about the repercussions of the port agreement on the Horn of Africa peace and security and geopolitical landscape. Now, I know that we've been reflecting a lot on the same question. That's the same kind of issue that have to raise. The ambassadors reflected on it. Pretty much everybody seemed to have a lot of concern about the effect on the geopolitical security environment on this. So I'm not entirely sure whether it's a new question we need to answer, but we've gone over it. But that seems kind of a recurring question. Harry, did you want to make a contribution?
If possible, yeah. Do you hear me, by the way?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, a contribution, I don't know. It's more a question to Jet Odermatt in particular, because he knows much better than I do in situations like this that international law is a very flexible type of instrument often. More is possible than one usually thinks, and the instruments change a little bit. So the question we have here is, there are all kinds of agreements possible between, let's say, a state like Ethiopia and Somaliland. there can be no doubt that nowadays many more, in terms of nature, agreements are possible than, let's say, 100 years ago. And then this was much more difficult. However, in the experience of international relations, we see gradually that if let's say, the healthy interests of states are at stake, then agreements are easily accepted. However, there is a particular borderline. And the question is where that borderline actually is. Is the problem here that the partner is Somaliland, which is, after all, yes, for the international community, a part of the state of Somalia? Or is the issue really that Ethiopia should not have a naval basis on the Red Sea? Well, the last issue doesn't seem to me any real problem. I mean, all kinds of states outside the region have established naval bases or half naval bases in the Horn of Africa. Like Djibouti has a basis, as far as I know, of the Americans, of the French, and even of the Chinese. Although I'm not that particularly on account of this, but I've seen reports. So apparently these things happen. So what is precisely the problem of Ethiopia having a naval base in one way or another on one of the coastlines? Basically, I don't see the problem there. The problem is clearly something else. That is to say, the partner has an aspect of being unacceptable. As long as it is a civil agreement, as long as it is an agreement which is short of being in the naval area, then there cannot really be a big problem under international law. But where is the borderline precisely? Suppose Ethiopia concludes an agreement with Somaliland, and we forget for the moment about the issue of recognition, why not? And it is an agreement which focuses on matters of, well, helping to police the territorial waters, or a bit more than that. Would that be allowed under international law, or have we passed the border? Is it state activity that is the borderline? Naval, of course, being the ultimate kind of, but where are we now? Is international law changing in this respect? Is it possible to creep into state activities with those agreements? That's basically the question.
Thanks, Harry. And I think part of your question, you also seem to answer it as well and agree with you on this issue of that international law is flexible as well. I agree on that point. And we often focus on state-to-state treaties in international law, and in the whole discussion of Somaliland, focus on its status in international law. And what I want to point out is not just with Somaliland, but other unrecognized or de facto states do have this practice of different kinds of agreements, whether you want to call them agreements or treaties. This does take place. So I think legally there's no impediment to having an agreement with a territory that is not recognized as a state. I think I mentioned that in the brief presentation to state that that's not the legal impediment. And on the issue, is it a problem because this is an agreement on the use of territory that could be used for naval purposes? No, because leases in international law, as you probably understand, are a very kind of strange entity in international law, somewhere between a private law contract, but usually done in a treaty form, done around the world, not just in the Horn of Africa, but other parts of the world. Probably the most famous one that we're all aware of is this whole Guantanamo, of course. There's no real one law on leases in international law, and they are concluded with territories or entities that aren't states. So I think we've got this dimension. We're talking about politically, is this something that causes tensions in the region? The idea that this would implicitly or explicitly lead to recognition of Somaliland by one state. This causes tensions, but whether or not an agreement can legally be concluded with a territory that is not a state in international law is a separate question. I think that this would be something that would be a formal agreement, whether or not and how it might be enforced, in which courts, and so on, if they ever got to that. That might be another related question that's very, very interesting. But I don't think that the problem comes with the status of Somaliland. And again, this is very difficult to talk about when I think Professor Boca also mentioned in her presentation that just talking about something where we don't have the text of the agreements, lawyers like text, no matter what label you put on the text itself, is not what we call the text. We look at the types of wording that is being used, what's actually agreed on, what the intention of the parties are, and so on, before we can assess the legal nature of it. So I also have to add that as another thing that we actually don't. We're talking about things that we haven't seen and don't know the details of. I mean, I clarified a bit on that issue. Yeah?
I'm very conscious of the ambassador's caution to us to say you cannot just read this in a very theoretical way because there's just so many moving parts to this. And I want to pick up on Harry's point about Ethiopia's entitlement to enter into an agreement, even if a naval agreement, to suggest it probably, shouldn't matter and international law is moving on. Is this where international law and the reality kind of begin to clash? That I'm not entirely sure whether we should walk away quietly like this because we need to dig into the back of this a little bit more from what international law says and what really happens on the ground. But anyway, I just thought I'll throw this in there. Dr. Volker, you have a little contribution of your own, yes.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to also reflect a little bit on Harry's question and Jed's answer, and then offer some thoughts I had myself. So this MOU, but again, we don't know the exact details of the text, so we only know how it's been reported about. But supposedly, it also grants an area of sea. So we're not just talking about an area of land to build a naval base, which, as Harry said, happens across the globe. We're not just talking about port state access or the transit of goods, which again is a very common thing. But supposedly, we're also talking about an area of 12 nautical miles that Ethiopia would be able to use. So in other words, territory or maritime territory has now been leased or granted, or whatever verb we want to put there, from Somaliland to Ethiopia. And so then my question, so I think that is unique and interesting, realizing that Somaliland is not a recognized state under international law. And so while I agree with Jed that there are different theories on statehood, and there are theories and then there's also practice, and how you frame the idea of, well, usually we talk about treaties between states, but perhaps treaties or MOUs can also be concluded between a state and a de facto state or an entity that is allowed to conclude agreements. But at the same time, the only legal entity that we know in international law that has territory is the state, right? So the recognized subject of international law that has territory is the state. International organizations, even though they have international legal personality, don't have territory. So the fact that in this MOU, supposedly maritime territory has been transferred, leased, given to a state, what does that then say about the entity being allowed to conclude treaties? Or does that actually already hint towards at least Ethiopia's recognition of Somaliland as a state? So that's sort of my. I mean, first, the sort of a very basic question I had before you started talking was, well, if Somaliland is not a state, how could the MOU have been concluded in the first place? Because if it does not, exist in the international legal sphere as a legal person, then it doesn't have, it can't enter into the treaty negotiation process. But then you offer this idea of, well, perhaps there is an entity that under international law that might not be a state, but still has the authority to conclude agreements. But what if that agreement that actually specifically concerns the transfer of territory, even for a limited moment in time? How does that change the issue of statehood in this regard? Thank you.
Now, Jed, I mean, do you want to say something very quickly, and I'll go to Ambassador Rondos?
Yes, very briefly. I think that, well, this doesn't fit any of our usual ideas of how these things work, of course. I think someone asked a question about whether or not it's an area where the law then follows practice. I think that's what will happen. We have something which just will de facto take place, if it happens, and then the law somehow has to fit into that. And I do recognize that this is different from other agreements to do with transfer of suspects and so on, the focus of other agreements. It is because it's dealing with territory. But I can't give you an answer that say, well, it fits into this kind of idea of international law, because it is something which pushes the boundaries, and international law will have to catch up and follow up. But I think that's the way international law develops, and it would then be, even without explicit recognition, that would be Ethiopia's implicit recognizing statehood. I think I agree with you on that one.
But how true is that in terms of number of participants in the region not necessarily endorsing it? I'm looking at Somalia for a start. Is international law going to do? Somalia has its own allies and its own interests, and I'm thinking when the United States and the EU eventually get involved with this, taking into account their own interests, particularly think of the Houthis in Yemen and the implications that this can have in that region. This may not necessarily follow that international law will follow the practice, because there are, as Ambassador Rondos keeps telling us, way too many moving parts. Can we just assume that it will necessarily just calmly and smoothly follow the practice? Will the law emerge out of this the same way that this practice is emerging?
I mean, there are plenty of instances in international law where certain practice of states doesn't fit with how we kind of conceive and teach how international law works. So this would only be developing practice if other states over time were to recognize this as a legal situation. But I mean, the situation of Somaliland for decades controlling territory and acting like a de facto state without real international relations on the legal level is also an anomaly in international law as well. So I think that we will just have practice which will be an anomaly that's not recognized by not just states in the region, but other states as well. I mean, people who are law of the sea experts and people who have much more understanding of that will also have to talk about things like the status of ships that enter into that port and certificates and these kinds of things that I'm also not an expert on. But maybe practice in that area will also congeal over time, but I'm not an expert in that area either.
Right. Ambassador Rondos, I expect a little bit more realism coming from you, and then I'll go to Harry.
Yeah, thank you. I wish I weren't sort of a hostage of the realism and experience I've had to be confronted by. But two or three thoughts come to mind here. One is, I really hope, I don't know what the context is, you can continue this, because you need to dig deeper into the issues that are being raised. Why? Somaliland made its decision rightly not to commit its fate to that of the rest of Somalia, because 30 years ago, Somalia descended into sheer hell. Now, 30 years on, this territory and its inhabitants are trying to find a way to get recognition and the like, which is not easy. And lately, let's remember, Somaliland has its own politics too. And one has to unpack all of this, which we're not going to do now. But one needs to be mindful of that. Let me throw you a hypothetical. What happens if one of the clans or sub-clans of Somaliland gather together and approach the government of Ethiopia and say, we feel we're not being adequately protected, we want this port, we want this road, would you please send troops in? Okay? And what happens then if Ethiopia pulls a very interesting number and calls up Mogadishu and says, we've been asked to do this, would you give us permission? I mean, that's the world I have to live in. But it's not that unrealistic. Huh? Abkhazia did it to Russia not long ago, 2008. I was there when that happened, as did Ossetia. And we can go on and on. So what is the legal rabbit hole down which we end up with that? But at the same time, politically, I don't exclude those sorts of options. Just as Puntland, right next door to Somaliland, which exercises a very sort of autonomous approach, as it were, to Somalia, may also decide to come to decisions. After all, Puntland has all sorts of deals with the Emiratis and who knows what else. Emiratis have had troops there for years, and contractors and the like. So we're in a very fluid situation. Now, how do you flip this? And ask a very simple question. And this is where I think people who are looking from the legal, sort of commercial, legal, and many other aspects of this, need to find out how can one create a practice by which a place like Somaliland, where the population just seems not to want to submit to the rule of Mogadishu, and does not want to be part of a federal entity, and I don't even want to go down to what could be negotiated, but what in practice can be put together to allow engagement with this entity in such a way that it does not become subject to predatory and capricious interpretations of law depending on the times, because things could change in 1 year. That's my question. You know, every year, the majority of the camels and the goats, which are exported to Saudi during the Hajj, come via Somalia. That is the wealth of Somaliland and of much of Somalia. So there are all sorts of massive transactions of very considerable value that involve Somaliland, and there are tacit arrangements. So what is it one can build on in this? That is why the context of the MOU, if you look at it in that way, and you leave aside the question of recognition, whether it's in the MOU or not, which rightly everyone said no one's seen the text, there is room for practical arrangements. And I think this is where, from the side of Somaliland and those who would like to be helpful to them, but also to Somalia, is to find ways in which one can identify practice that, if you will, moves from the occasional to the customary and then can become part of law, which then others who are involved in diplomacy and things like that can say, well, now we've got precedent and it can work. Now, this may not be satisfactory to Somaliland, it may not be satisfactory to Ethiopia, but actually it is fundamentally in interest to see if this can become seen as develop a practice that creates precedent. My final point, or third point I'd like to make is, there's an element here where one really has to be very careful and look ahead. And here I speak to those who really understand law. I'm fascinated by the fact that Somaliland per se is not the issue. It is that a very large country has chosen to seek a military base in a very, very fragile area, which is called the Gulf of Aden, which when I look at this, I say, well, why are you doing this? That gives you the ability to project. Project what to what end? After all, Socotra is just right next to it. Is this about controlling access to the Red Sea? Is it about, national vanity is fine, but the practical implications for others become a very real issue. And I don't know to what extent the law and international law speaks to this. Does it limit people's capacity to project power, military power, on the basis that it is opening a base in a transit territory, leave aside whether that territory is an independent state or not? But when I look at it, I jump to that conclusion. What prevents this becoming a new actor in an arena that is very insecure?
Sounds like a very good question for Harry. What does international law say about a regional powerful country entering into a transient state That's the word that the ambassador used, or a de facto state. I mean, at all, what's the state? As I gather from Dr. Volker and Alderman, nothing. Nothing stops Ethiopia from doing what it does, as far as the law is concerned. But anyway, I'll let you, the expert, Harry, reflect on that.
No, I wouldn't. I think you put too much weight on what I might say on this matter. I think I cannot agree more with what Alex Rondos has just said. I mean, the issue is in the first place that indeed a security matter. I mean, it has an impact if a state like Ethiopia, which is a great power in the Horn, of course, although it may look to some to be in quite a mess, but it's in terms of sheer population, Ethiopia is by far the biggest power in the Horn of Africa. So when it moves, however it moves almost, yes, that has an impact on the security situation. And I think exactly the questions come up then as Alex Rondas has put them forward. What has international law to say about this? Well, I don't think international law has to say anything in terms of, well, it is not allowed for a state not having a coast to establish a naval base. No, of course, that is possible. The only question is, how is it done? If it is done in the sense that it's done in the territory of a state who has not given permission, because, well, it is the territory of Somalia. Somalia would argue that that's how the situation is, and we don't want to give permission for this. Well, that is an international legal problem, without any doubt. You're not allowed to do that without permission. However, the permission is given by a government which is there as well and which controls the area for quite a while. Although it is not recognized, it has all the practical power to allow a thing like that. Then the question to international law is indeed one, how flexible is it? What do leases, well, what is set as a limit to a lease of this sort, actually, by international law? And I'm inclined to say, and that was the gist of my question to Jet Odermatt, well, I don't think there is much of a limit. And the problem is how it is done here. The territory is apparently not under the control of the state who is or the government, the entity who is concluding the agreement, not at least not in the formal sense. Somalia doesn't agree. And that's a problem. You can't get around it. However, it is Ethiopia certainly free to conclude an agreement with a state who gives permission. An Ethiopian basis in Djibouti, if Djibouti likes to do that, or wherever on the coast, well, I don't see any legal objection there, really. Maybe a security objection. It may be that indeed precisely what is it said, and I'm sure it is. It is a matter of throwing a stone in a not so peaceful pond, and it has an impact. But we're not talking about a question of international law, I think. So I'm very flexible all of a sudden, Mike.
Yes, that's the nature of international law and international lawyers, as far as I understand. But this question that you raised about statehood and sovereignty and consent, these are the key pillars. And that if you really want it to be formal, this piece of land still remains part of Somalia. And that technically you need Somalia's consent to be able to access this. But Somalia does not have control. So what is the relationship between the idea of being a sovereign state and not being in control? If this question were to be posed before the International Court of Justice, i.e. if Somalia were to bring an action against Ethiopia for, in this case, entering its territory without, what in the jurisprudence or in the theory will be the court's guidance? I mean, what kind of outcome would be if the court were posed with this question. Will it take the formal position or will it take the pragmatic position? I mean, how will you, as an international lawyer, and I mean Dr. Volker, Harry Post, Dr. Oderman, and all the international lawyers on the call, how would you answer this question? Sovereignty against control. Do you lose sovereignty because you don't have control, or do you remain sovereign regardless of? Because we've had situations where governments or states are considered still sovereign. Somalia is a cluster, yet it's complete chaos. That's okay, it's still sovereign. In other words, we still need your permission. In this instance, though, the question is they don't have control, and yet Ethiopia has overlooked them. Is that internationally wrongful act that the court can judge?
Yeah, well, should I start among all these international lawyers? I think basically, yes, the answer of the court would probably be yes, that it is a wrongful act, and that this is not allowed. That is precisely crossing a border that is not supposed to be crossed. So nothing against naval presence of Ethiopia along the borders of the Red Sea. I mean, that can all be done, although it sure has security implications. But basically, if Somalia doesn't give permission to establish a naval base on its territory, then we are talking about a wrongful act, and I think we are still talking about a wrongful act, however flexible international agreements can be. And I don't see really a way out of that point.
Good.
Yeah, maybe I could just ask Harry a question, or the other international law panelists a question on this one, because I evaded the question earlier when I said I said it would be an unfriendly act, which would be something which is not involving a violation of a legal obligation, right? Something that's unfriendly but not a violation. Would you be saying that this would be a violation of the UN Charter, the territorial integrity of Somalia, an agreement between Ethiopia and Somalia, or a UN Security Council resolution? I'd also want to think in less abstract terms about what the source of the obligation is that Ethiopia would be violating as well. I think you could make an argument if you wanted to represent Somalia. I agree that the court, if it came to the ICHA or a tribunal, would take that position about the continued statehood of Somalia, but it would have to identify what violation that act, what legal obligation that act would be violating. Perhaps you could find that in the UN Security Council or actions. I don't know,
yeah.
Or in the UN Charter, but or other sources.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I would think you need to discuss in more detail.
Yes, I would say, if I may, I would say, yeah, that is a clear violation of territorial integrity.
But that means you're taking the formal position that
Yes.
Somalia, without the control of a particular space, is still entitled to kind of issue the directives in that space as well. And literally then making Somaliland illegitimate.
Well, yes, that's the problem. As long as it has not improved its status, that would remain the problem. And that's perhaps also why there is so much to do about the content of the MOU. Does it indeed involve the recognition by the major power in the Horn of Africa of its statehood? Because in that sense, yes, then that would be a very relevant part of the story. That doesn't mean, as has rightly been said, that all of a sudden Somaliland would be a state, or that its legal personality would be at the level of a state, but it certainly would have made considerable progress in that direction. That's how states can emerge. I mean, there is some kind of agreement. Take South Sudan, and then at some point there are more foreign states who say yes, okay, this is okay, and then of course there is an agreement between Sudan and South Sudan, and then the status is reached. This is not yet the case in Somaliland.
Dr. Volker, does the law of the sea throw a completely different light on this? I mean, because I get the impression from your presentation that it is a lot more tolerable to some of these quirky bits of international law, access to territory and, transient state can actually, if you're in control, you need to be required to give access and so on. It looks like UNCLOS seem to favor Somaliland.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with that, because if we go back to it, UNCLOS is a treaty that has been signed and ratified by states. So UNCLOS only provides obligations and rights to member states or other states, but the treaty was negotiated and signed and ratified by states. So it is very clear on that. The part on rights of landlocked states speaks about states rather than states parties. So in that sense, it's a little bit more flexible, that it recognizes rights for other states that might not have ratified UNCLOS. But I wouldn't, and yes, it recognizes rights of transit and port access, but it is still only access. It's not the transfer of sovereignty or of territory like the MOU might have done. And furthermore, it still has that obligation of a bilateral or a regional agreement. So even though it recognizes rights of landlocked states, it's coupled with this obligation of transit states and landlocked states to enter into agreement to further define how that right of transit might be operationalized. So I don't think I would support the conclusion that UNCLOS supports Somaliland as a state or anything like that. I'm not sure the ICJ would conclude that this would have been a violation of international law. I think the ICJ would have tried any way possible to avoid answering that question, because I think it has a lot of repercussions for other situations such as Kosovo, Palestine, Taiwan, etc. So I think the ICJ would be very, very cautious when it would get this request, if it would get this request in answering it. And it would certainly be an interesting read, whatever they come up with. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm going to pose this final question because I think this conversation can extend. Somalia decides that it's entitled as a sovereign state whose territory has been kind of interfered to countermeasures. I imagine international law allows for that. And it takes some countermeasures against Ethiopia. Would that be considered legitimate, illegitimate? What can Somalia do in the circumstances? In this instance, pointing fingers at Ethiopia. We've often talked a lot about Ethiopia is entitled to do this. Ethiopia is entitled to do. What is it that Somalia is entitled to do?
Well, sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I just want to say everything simple, everything short of military measures. I mean, it will probably not do that because Ethiopia is a little bit big, but still, yeah.
But that depends. It ultimately depends or hinges upon the conclusion that there has been an internationally wrongful act. Only then are you allowed to do countermeasures. So countermeasures are acts that would have otherwise been unlawful, but because they are in a response to an internationally wrongful act by another state, the unlawfulness is taken away. So you'd first need to prove that there is indeed an internationally wrongful act before, according to international law, practice is a different story, but according to international law, you would be allowed to take countermeasures. And then the RCUA, the Articles on the Responsibility of States, has a whole list of possible countermeasures that might be applicable.
The reason I pose that question is that in international law, the state is the first entity entitled to interpret its own obligations before you go to litigation. I mean, go to Security Council Article 51, all of it. It's about if you're under threat, you decide for yourself until we can get this sorted. So it will be Somalia that decides in the first instance whether this is an international legal act, or because international law doesn't require that you must wait to go to the ICJ, which, by the way, you tell me the ICJ will do everything to avoid answering the question. Why should Somalia even go there? And so it decides that we, on our own, until proved otherwise, believe this is an internationally legal act and we're entitled to countermeasure. And then we go to countermeasure before, somebody proves us otherwise. So there is the risk that the proof is not sitting somewhere that Somalia can go and take. The proof is with Somalia, isn't it? For it to decide that, okay, from what we're seeing, they've invaded our territory without asking us, an international legal act, frankly, we're going to counter it. But what I was actually seeing is if Somalia enters into an agreement with Kenya and Sudan and other regional countries and say, right, for what's happened to us, we would like to have a piece of Ethiopian land for farming. I imagine this is the same issue. It will be completely legal. I'm not quite sure what I'm playing with, but the hypotheticals are getting Anyways, now I don't see any more hands up, but what I thought we set up to look at was on this question of access to sea on this Ethiopia-Somaliland port deal. We wanted to look at the legal issues, the political issues, security issues, and economic issues. I think we have very clearly kind of got ourselves messed up with all the legal issues, as typical lawyers do. The Ambassador Randers and Dr. Getschov have made very clear what the political issues are. We've also heard a lot about the security issues. I must say, we have not been able to explore the economic aspect. Harry, you have put up another webinar on the economic, because there must be some economic dynamics underlying this thing which we haven't been able to explore. So that is the one thing we haven't been able to bring up into the conversation. But otherwise, I think we've had a very fruitful and rewarding conversation with a lot of issues unanswered, but that's what these webinars do to allow us to continue to reflect. So I don't know about Lubin. Somebody else needs to kind of tell us what the next steps are, but as far as I can see from where I sit, I should be able to thank our contributors, particularly our panelists. I want to thank Ambassador Randers. I want to thank Dr. Boker, Jed Odermatt, and Enoch Donichao, and Dr. Mohammed Farah. So on behalf of the organizers, it's been such a pleasure moderating this, and I thank you very much indeed.
Now, there's one thing left, moderator, if I may almost take over, and that is, of course, to thank you for an excellent and very competent and after all, friendly job you did, although you were severe, and also thank the panelists all. I think something was said about economic matters, that is by Ambassador Rondos. We should not forget the trade in Somaliland of goats and camels, large scale to Saudi Arabia. I mean, that should not be ignored totally, but I'm sure we could talk more about other economic matters, and perhaps we will. Well, finally, then, all this, I thank you again, Michael Edo, very much for what you've done here. Thank you all, as Michael said already. The ICHA will provide, as it has done before, a summary of what has been said, which is always something of an undertaking. But with the help of the genius people in Leuven, we manage usually to get a recording of our contributions, and that is very helpful if you're talking about making a summary. So in that sense, at some point we will come back to you with this summary, and that's it for today. I thank you very much, and we'll do our best to, attempt at least to contribute a little bit to solving problems in the Horn. That's all what we can do. I think there are enough problems in the Horn, and just making a little contribution in a good direction, I hope that is what we have been doing by, basically presenting lots of voices on this subject, which after all has certainly produced a lot of tension in the Horn. And who knows, perhaps the tension goes down 1 or 2 degrees, then we have done something this afternoon already. Thank you very much, and have further a very good day, wherever you are at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
لو طغينا مسسكو نوفى لنا نفرح بنا كنتبع لنا سبسي أي تفرح نحق فرح نزقيها فرح